You want to know the strangest thing about that morning? It was boring. That's the part nobody believes when I tell them. They expect alarms. They expect shouting, running, that kind of thing. But for the first few hours, it was the most ordinary day I'd ever spent inside those walls. Quiet. A bit gray outside. The sort of day you forget by dinner time. I didn't forget it. I'll never forget it. Let me back up, because if I just start at the moment it happened, none of it will land. You have to understand the place first. You have to feel how still it was before everything cracked open. So, about 4 years ago now, I was working a short contract at the palace. Nothing grand, I want to be honest with you. I wasn't anyone important. I was a junior assistant on the conservation side, the people who look after the objects, the furniture, the small precious things that get put out when the public comes through in the summer. 26 years old, badly paid, and quietly thrilled to be there every single morning. I used to walk in through the staff entrance and have to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself grinning like an idiot. My job that particular week was simple. There was a special display being prepared. A few pieces that had belonged to the late Queen were going to be shown in one of the state rooms behind glass for the public. Among them was a brooch, and that brooch is the reason I'm telling you any of this. I remember the first time I saw it up close. One of the senior conservators, a woman named Margaret who'd been there longer than I'd been alive, lifted it out of its case with these little white cotton gloves and set it on the velvet pad in front of me. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just let me look. It was sapphire and diamond. Old. The kind of blue you don't get in shops. A deep blue that seemed to hold light inside it instead of bouncing it back. The diamonds around it were small, but they caught everything. The lamp, the window, my own reflection bent and tiny. I leaned in without thinking and Margaret said very softly, "Hands behind your back, love." Not cross. Just the way you tell a child near a hot stove. Was it really hers? I asked. It was really hers, Margaret said, and there was something in the way she said it, like the brooch wasn't just an object, like it had been somewhere, seen things, sat on a shoulder through moments the rest of us only watched on television. I felt it too, standing there. A little ache I couldn't name. That was Tuesday. The thing I'm going to tell you happened on the Friday. Now the guards. People always ask about the guards, so let me get to them, because one of them is the whole point of this story. You've seen them even if you've never been to London. The tall bearskin hats, the red tunics, standing dead still while tourists wave hands in their faces and pull silly faces trying to make them laugh. Most people think it's a costume, a bit of theater for the cameras. And I'll admit, before I worked there, I thought the same. I thought it was a job you did for the photos. It is not a job you do for the photos. There was one in particular. I never knew his full name. We weren't supposed to be familiar with them, and they certainly weren't paid to chat with conservation assistants. But I knew his face, because for that whole week he was posted near the corridor that ran past the room we were working in. Tall, even without the hat. Young, maybe a little older than me, though it was hard to tell with the chin strap and the stillness. Brown eyes. And the most absolute, complete stillness I have ever seen in a living person. I used to test it, God forgive me. We all did, the younger staff. We'd walk past slowly, drop a folder a bit too loudly. Once a girl from the catering team sneezed 3 times right next to him, this enormous wet sneeze, and he didn't so much as blink. Didn't flinch. His eyes stayed level, fixed on some point we couldn't see, somewhere out past all of us. I started to find it almost unnerving. How does a person switch themselves off like that? But after a few days I understood it wasn't off. It was the opposite of off. He wasn't asleep behind those eyes. He was watching everything. He was watching all of us all the time and just choosing to let none of it move him. There's a difference. It took me a while to feel the difference, but once I did I couldn't unfeel it. I'm telling you about him now, before anything happens, because I want you to understand what kind of man was standing in that corridor. So that later, when it matters, you'll already know. Right, the week itself. By Thursday, the display was nearly ready. The big public opening was set for the weekend, and there was that buzz you get before any opening, that low hum of too many people doing too many small jobs at once. Polishing, checking light levels, someone arguing about the wording on a little printed card. The brooch and the other pieces were going to be set into their cases on the Friday morning, locked in, and then left under guard until the doors opened. Friday morning I got in early. I liked getting in early. The palace before the public arrives is a different place, hushed, almost holding its breath. Your footsteps sound enormous. You feel like a trespasser even with a pass clipped to your jacket. The weather was gray, like I said. A flat, soft London gray, the kind that isn't quite rain but makes everything outside look like it's behind a net curtain. I remember standing at a window with a cup of tea before we started, looking out at the wet gravel and thinking it was going to be a slow one. A nothing day. We'd set the pieces, lock the cases, and most of us would be twiddling our thumbs by lunch. Margaret was off that morning, doctor's appointment, so it was me and two others on the floor, a man called Derek who'd been doing the job about 10 years and treated it like he was filing invoices, and a newer member of staff I didn't know very well. He'd only started a few weeks before. Quiet bloke, polite, helpful even. He'd carried boxes for me twice without being asked, and on a contract like that, where everyone's tired and underpaid, you remember the people who are kind without a reason. I'm not going to give you his name. I'll just call him the new one. You'll understand why in a minute. We started laying out the pieces around 7:30. Derek had the list and was ticking things off, reading out the catalog numbers in this flat, bored voice. The new one and I were doing the careful work, the lifting and the placing, gloves on, slow, slow, always slow. You learn quickly in that job that the fast hand is the hand that breaks something priceless, so you move like you're underwater. The brooch came near the end. It was in its own small case, separate from the rest, and Derek made a little point of it, holding the case up and saying, "Star of the show, this one." He wasn't wrong. Of all the pieces going out, the brooch was the one people would queue to see, the one that would end up on 100 phone screens by Saturday afternoon. I lifted it out myself. I want you to know that. My own gloved hands lifted that brooch out of its case and set it on the display mount, this little angled velvet cushion inside the glass cabinet. My hands were shaking a tiny bit, not from nerves exactly, more from the weight of it, not physical weight. It was light, the other weight. The one Margaret had passed to me on the Tuesday with 3 words. It was really hers. I got it seated, stepped back. The new one was beside me and he leaned in too, looking at it, and I remember he said something quiet, almost to himself. Beautiful, just that. And I agreed with him. We stood there a second, the two of us, two badly paid temporary nobodies, looking at this small blue thing that had outlived a queen. Then Derek said the lid had to go on and be locked, and the morning rolled on, and I thought nothing more of that quiet moment for hours. Here's where I have to slow down, because the next part is the part I've gone over 1,000 times in my head, looking for the moment I should have noticed, looking for the thing I missed. After the pieces were set and the cases locked, there was that lull I told you about. The display was done. The public weren't coming till the weekend. There was a strange empty hour where the 3 of us had finished the careful work but weren't free to leave, so we sort of drifted. Derek went off to find coffee. I tidied the workroom, the place behind the scenes where we kept the boxes and the tools and the spare velvet and all the unglamorous stuff the public never sees. The new one stayed near the display. And I noticed it, I did notice it, but I told myself a story about it. I told myself a kind story because he'd been kind to me. I saw him standing by the cabinet looking at the brooch, and I thought, he's like me, he can't quite believe he gets to be this close to it. That's what I thought. That's the story I told myself, because that's the story I'd have wanted someone to tell about me. I went back into the workroom. I was in there maybe 10 minutes sorting empty boxes when something small happened that I can only describe as a feeling. You know the one, when a room goes wrong and you can't say how. I'd left the door to the display area half open and I realized slowly that I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps. No Derek coming back with the coffees. No murmur of the few other staff around. Just this thick, padded silence. And then I heard a sound that didn't belong. A tiny one. A little metallic click, very soft, the kind of sound you wouldn't even register on a normal day with a normal noise around you. But in that silence it landed like a dropped plate. I want to be honest about what I felt because I think people imagine you become a hero in a moment like that. You don't. I felt confused. I felt like I'd probably misheard. My first instinct, the absolute first thing my brain reached for, was an excuse. Probably nothing. Probably Derek. Probably the heating. The human brain will do anything, anything at all, to avoid believing that something terrible is happening 3 meters away. I stepped towards the half-open door. I didn't run. I want to be clear, I wasn't brave. I just walked over to look, the way you'd look up if a light flickered. And through the gap in the door I saw him. The new one, he was at the cabinet, and the cabinet was open. I need to explain why that froze me, because if you've never worked around something like that you won't feel it properly. Those cases don't just open. They're locked. We'd locked them. The keys were controlled, signed in and out, the whole thing. There was no reason on earth for that case to be open, and there was certainly no reason for him to have his hand inside it. But he did. His hand was inside the glass, and his fingers were closing around the brooch. I stood there in the gap of the door and I genuinely could not move. I've heard people say their blood ran cold and I always thought it was just a phrase, but that's exactly what it felt like. Something cold went through my chest and down my arms. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Nothing. I was useless. I just stood there watching this man I'd thought was kind, this man who'd carried boxes for me, lift the late Queen's brooch out of its case and slip it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He did it so smoothly. That's what got me. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't panicked. He'd done it like he'd practiced it, like he'd walked through it in his mind 100 times, and that smoothness told me everything I didn't want to know. This wasn't a man who'd lost his head in a moment of temptation. This was a plan. He'd been kind to me on purpose. He'd carried my boxes on purpose. He'd made himself into someone nobody would look at twice. And it had worked. Because here I was 2 days later, frozen behind a door, unable to even shout. He turned, and for one horrible second he looked straight at me. I'll never forget his face in that second. People always picture a villain looking cruel. He didn't look cruel, he looked sad, tired, almost ashamed, like a man caught doing something he already knew he'd regret. We just looked at each other through that gap, and the whole world held still. Then he ran. Not towards me. Away towards the far end of the room, towards the corridor, the one that led out past the visitor route, towards the door that would eventually, if you knew the building, take you out and away and gone. He moved fast and quiet, that same controlled smoothness, and I finally got my voice back and I shouted. I won't tell you exactly what I shouted because it wasn't dignified and it wasn't clever. It was just a noise. A single panicked word loud enough to hurt my own throat, and it was enough. It broke the silence in the building like a stone through a window. I heard Derek's voice somewhere shout back, confused. I heard footsteps. I heard my own heart, which sounds stupid, but I did, this thudding in my ears. The new one was already at the corridor. He was fast. He was going to make it. That's the thing nobody tells you about real moments like this. There's no music swelling, there's no slow motion, it's just horribly fast and you're horribly slow and the bad thing is winning. He turned the corner into the corridor at a dead run, the brooch in his pocket, the exit ahead of him, the whole thing about to be over before it had properly begun. And that's when he ran into the guard. I didn't see the collision. I was too far back, still half frozen in the workroom doorway. But I heard it. And I came round the corner a few seconds later, and what I saw I'm going to tell you about in a moment, because it's the part that changed how I see those silent men in the red tunics for the rest of my life. But first I have to tell you what the guard did not do, because that's what I keep coming back to. He didn't shout. He didn't pull out anything. He didn't even, in that first instant, seem to move quickly. I've been watching that man stand like a statue for a week, and in the one moment it mattered, the stillness didn't break the way you'd expect. It converted. All that held back attention, all that watching he'd been doing while we dropped folders and sneezed in his face, it had a purpose now, and the purpose arrived without a single wasted movement. I came round the corner, and the new one was on the floor. Not hurt. I want to be clear, he wasn't hurt, not really. But he was down, and the guard was standing over him, perfectly composed, and the thing I noticed, the thing that put a lump in my throat that's honestly still there 4 years later when I think about it, was this. The guard hadn't dropped his bearing. Even now, even with a thief on the floor in front of him and a priceless brooch about to vanish, he stood the way he'd stood all week. Straight. Controlled. Like the discipline wasn't a costume he could take off in an emergency, but the actual material he was made of, all the way through. And he was looking down at the man on the floor with an expression I can only describe as calm. Not angry. Calm. The way you'd look at a problem you already knew exactly how to solve. Derek came skidding round behind me and made a sound like he'd been punched. 2 other staff appeared. Somewhere an actual alarm started. Late, useless, long after the only thing that mattered had already been decided by one man who'd been standing in a corridor doing what everyone assumed was nothing. I'm going to stop there for a second. Because the next part, what the guard said and what was in that man's pocket and how it all ended, that's where this story really lives. But I need you to sit with the picture for a moment. A gray morning. A locked case that shouldn't have opened. A kind man who wasn't kind. A frozen girl behind a door who did nothing brave at all. And one silent guard who'd been watching the whole time, who everybody had walked past for days like he was furniture. We were all so sure we knew what he was. A photo opportunity. A statue in a hat. We had no idea. Here's the thing I learned that morning. Time doesn't move the way you think it does. For most of your life it just ticks along, even, boring, and you never notice it. And then something cracks open and suddenly you're living a single minute like it's an hour, noticing everything, every sound, every breath, the color of the light, the exact way a man is lying on a polished floor. So let me give you that minute properly, slowly, the way I lived it. The new one was down, the guard was over him, and for a second, maybe 2, nobody did anything at all. I keep saying nobody was brave. I want to keep being honest about that. Derek was behind me making little broken noises and not moving. The 2 other staff who'd appeared were just staring. And me, I was clutching the door frame like it might hold me up because my legs had stopped being reliable. 5 or 6 grown adults, and not one of us knew what to do with our own hands. The only person in that corridor who looked like he belonged in his own body was the guard. He hadn't said a word yet. He was just standing there looking down. And the man on the floor was starting to recover. You could see it, the shock of the fall wearing off, the panic coming back into his eyes. He shifted, got an elbow under himself, started to push up. And the guard moved. I can't fully describe it even now. It wasn't violent. That's the part that stays with me. I'd half expected in the back of my frozen brain that there'd be a struggle, that it would get ugly, the way these things look in films. It wasn't like that. The guard simply shifted his weight, put himself between the man and the corridor that led to the exit and stood. That was it. He just made himself a wall, and something in the way he did it. The total lack of doubt made the man on the floor stop trying to get up. They looked at each other. "Stay where you are," the guard said. That was the first time I heard his voice. All week he'd been silent, a statue, and now there were 3 words, low and very even, no anger in them at all. And those 3 words did more than any amount of shouting could have done, because they weren't a threat. They were just a fact. Stay where you are, like telling someone the weather. The man stayed where he was. I remember thinking in the middle of all that fear, so that's what the stillness was for. A whole week of standing motionless while we mocked him and tested him, and it was all so that in this exact moment when it counted, his voice could come out steady as a level. He had control of himself so completely that he could lend a little of it to the rest of us just by speaking. The corridor, which a second ago had been pure chaos in my chest, got quieter, calmer, because one man had decided it would be. The new one tried one more time. Not to run, he'd given that up, but to talk. And this is the part that breaks my heart a little, even now, even knowing what he'd done. "Please," he said, his voice cracked on it. "Please, I can't, you don't understand." "I understand you've got something that isn't yours," the guard said, still level, still calm, but not cold. "I want to be exact about this because it matters. There wasn't contempt in it. There was something almost gentle underneath the firmness, the way you'd speak to a person standing too near the edge of something. Take it out of your pocket and put it on the floor." The man didn't move. And here's where it got strange, where I saw something I didn't expect, something that's the real reason I've never been able to shut up about that morning. The guard could have grabbed him. He was bigger, stronger, in control. He could have just reached down and taken the brooch back. Nobody would have blamed him. We'd all have called it brave. But he didn't. He gave the man a chance to give it back himself. He stood there, this wall of red and discipline, and he waited, and he let the thief be the one to take it out of his own pocket. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. There's a difference between catching a man and stopping a man, and the guard wanted both. He wanted the brooch safe, yes. But I think he also wanted the man on the floor to have one last second of being a person who chose to do the right thing instead of a thing that got taken from him by force. I might be reading too much into it, but I was there, and that's what it felt like. The man's hand went to his jacket, slow, shaking, and he took out the brooch. I saw it again then, the blue, even in that flat gray corridor light. It caught what little light there was the way it always did, like it didn't need much, like it carried its own. The man held it in his open palm for a moment and looked at it, and the strangest expression crossed his face. Not greed. I'd expected greed. It was more like grief. Like he was looking at the thing that had ruined him, and he knew it, and it was too late. He set it down on the floor between them, very carefully. The same careful I'd been trained to use all week. Slow hands. He set down the late queen's brooch on the parquet floor of that corridor as gently as if it were made of breath, and then he took his hand away, and he sat back, and he started to cry. Nobody moved to comfort him. I'm not proud of that. But nobody moved to hurt him either. We all just stood in this awful, heavy quiet while a grown man wept on the floor of a palace, and the thing he'd tried to steal sat between his knees and the boots of the man who'd stopped him. The guard looked down at the brooch, then he looked at me. I don't know how he knew I was the conservation one. Maybe he'd watched me handle the pieces all week with that same silent attention he gave everything. Maybe it was just that I was the one standing closest who looked like I knew what to do with it. But he looked right at me and he said, quietly, "Don't touch it with your bare hands." And I started crying too, right there, out of nowhere. Because in the middle of all of it, the theft, the fear, the man falling apart on the floor, this guard had remembered, had thought about, the thing that actually mattered to me. The brooch, the object, the history of it. He'd thought even now, even in the middle of catching a thief, the oils on her skin could damage it. Don't touch it with your bare hands. I've never felt so seen by a stranger in my life. I got my gloves. They were still in my jacket pocket from the morning's work. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull them on, and Derek had to help me, and even Derek's hands were shaking, and the two of us, two trembling underpaid nobodies, knelt down on that floor, and one of us lifted the brooch and the other held the empty space around it like it was a wounded bird. We got it up. We held it. It was safe. And the guard, the whole time, did not move from his position between the thief and the exit. Not once. The brooch was back in safe hands, and he still stood there, still a wall, because the job wasn't whether the brooch was safe. The job was the man, and the man hadn't been handed over to anyone yet. So he stayed. Statue. Still again, except now I understood the stillness completely, and it didn't look cold to me anymore. It looked like the most reliable thing I'd ever seen in my life. Footsteps came. Real ones, finally, the proper response. People who knew what to do, security, the right people. I heard them coming down the corridor at a run, and I felt this enormous wave of relief, the kind that makes your knees go, because it meant I wasn't responsible anymore. It meant the grown-ups were here. It meant I could stop holding the world up. But here's the thing. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left to do. The guard had already done it. The brooch was in our gloved hands. The thief was on the floor and hadn't moved. The exit was blocked by a single man who hadn't so much as raised his voice. The whole emergency was already over, solved, handled by the time the people whose job it was to handle emergencies got there. That's what I think about now. By the time the cavalry came, there was no battle left to fight. One man standing in a corridor had ended it before it could become anything. They took the new one away. I won't dramatize it. There was no big scene. He didn't fight. He stood up when they told him to, slowly, like an old man, though he wasn't old, and he let them lead him off, and just before he went round the corner he looked back, not at the guard, at me. I'll never know what that look meant. I've turned it over and over, maybe sorry, maybe just shame at being seen by the one person who'd thought he was kind. I never found out the full story, why he did it, whether it was debt or desperation or just plain greed dressed up in a quiet, polite manner. We weren't told. People like me don't get told. But that look has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that morning. And then he was gone, and the corridor was full of people, and the noise came back, and the ordinary world rushed in to fill the silence that one man's stillness had held open just long enough. I want to tell you about the few minutes right after, because that's when the thing happened that I really came here to tell you about. In all the commotion, the security, the questions, the brooch being carried off to be checked and resecured, the guard quietly stepped back. He'd done his part, and the proper thing, the system, took over, the way it's supposed to. And I watched him do something that I think about more than anything else from that day. He went back to his post. I'm not joking. There was still chaos in the building. People were everywhere. And this man, who had just single-handedly stopped a theft, who had every right in the world to sit down, to be congratulated, to be the center of it all, he simply walked back to the spot in the corridor where he'd been standing all week, and he resumed his position. Straight back, eyes level, hands where they belonged, still as stone. Like nothing had happened, like it was just Friday. Like stopping a thief was simply one more thing that might occur during a shift, no more worthy of fuss than the rain outside. I stood there with the late Queen's brooch being carried past me, and I watched this man go back to looking like furniture, back to the thing we'd all mocked him for, and I understood for the first time in my life what discipline actually is. It isn't the standing still. Any statue can stand still. It's the going back to standing still. After. When everything in you must be screaming with adrenaline and pride, and the wild animal need to tell somebody what you just did. To swallow all of that and simply return to your post. Because the post still needs standing. Because the job didn't end just because the dramatic part did. I have never been able to do that, not once in my life. And I watched a stranger do it without effort on a gray Friday morning, and it changed me. Derek came and stood next to me. We were both still in our gloves. He looked at the guard and he looked at me and he said in this small voice, "I've worked here 10 years. I never once said good morning to one of them." I knew exactly what he meant. We'd all walked past these men for years, tested them, mocked them, treated them like part of the wallpaper, a bit of theater, a tourist's photo. And it had never once occurred to any of us that behind that stillness was a person who would, without hesitation, put himself between us and disaster and not even mention it afterwards. I'm going to stop part 2 here because there's one more thing that happened. Something small. Something that I almost didn't tell anyone because it sounds like I made it up. But I didn't. It's the reason this whole story has stayed lit up inside me for 4 years, and it's how it really ended. But for now, just hold this picture with me one more time. A brooch, safe again, in gloved and shaking hands. A thief, gone, carrying whatever made him do it off into a life I'll never know about. And a guard, back at his post, standing perfectly still in an empty corridor, as if the most important thing he'd done all morning was simply to be there. We thought the standing still was the easy part. It was the hardest thing in the room, so here's the small thing. The one I almost never tell because every time I do I can see people deciding whether they believe me, and I understand why. It's the kind of moment that sounds too neat, too much like something someone made up for an ending. But I was there and it happened and I've stopped caring whether it sounds real. It was real to me. That's enough. It was about an hour later. The building had calmed down by then in that strange, exhausted way a place calms after something big. People were still talking in low voices in corners. There were forms to fill in, statements to give, all the dull machinery that grinds into motion after the dramatic part is over. I'd given mine, stumbling through it, my voice not quite my own. The brooch had been taken away, checked, found unharmed, thank God, and resecured somewhere I wasn't told about. The display would go ahead at the weekend after all. The public would queue and look at that blue stone and never know what it had been through on a quiet Friday morning, never know how close they came to seeing an empty velvet cushion behind the glass. I needed air. My hands had finally stopped shaking, but I felt hollowed out, the way you do after a fright passes and leaves you scraped clean inside. So I went and stood by a window in a quiet stretch of corridor, the same window I'd stood at that morning with my tea, thinking it would be a nothing day. The gray hadn't lifted. The gravel outside was still wet. It looked exactly the same as it had at 8:30. That bothered me somehow. That the world outside could look so completely unchanged when everything inside me had been rearranged. And the guard walked past. He was off his post now, finally, hours into it, being relieved or moving between duties. I don't know the rhythm of it. Out of the corridor where he'd stood all week. And for a moment it was just the two of us in that quiet stretch, him passing through me by the window, and I did the thing I'd never done all week. I spoke to him. "Thank you," I said. It came out smaller than I wanted. Croaky. 2 words, the same number he'd used to stop a thief, and they felt hopelessly inadequate for what I was trying to say. He stopped, he looked at me, and off his post, out of the rigid stillness, his face was different, younger, tired around the eyes, just a man after all who'd had a very long morning. "You did well," he said. I actually laughed, a horrible little broken laugh because it was so absurd. "I didn't do anything," I said. "I froze, I just stood there, I couldn't even shout properly." And he shook his head slowly and he said something I have carried with me every single day since. He said, "You shouted. That's the only reason I knew to move. I can't see round corners." He paused. "You think you froze, but you made a sound at exactly the right second. That's not nothing, that's the whole thing. I want you to understand what that did to me." Because I'd spent the entire hour since it happened drowning in shame, telling myself I was useless, that a braver person would have tackled him, would have done something, would have been a hero. And here was the actual hero, the one man in the building who'd actually stopped it, telling me that my one panicked, undignified, embarrassing shout was the hinge the whole thing turned on. That without it, he'd have stood at his post, blind to the corridor behind him, and the man would have walked out the door and the brooch would have been gone forever. He didn't have to say that. He'd already done the brave thing. He'd already gone back to his post without a word. He had nothing to gain by stopping in a corridor to comfort a crying conservation assistant he'd never see again. But he did it anyway. He took the time, when he must have been exhausted, to hand a frightened young woman back a piece of herself she'd dropped. That's the thing nobody tells you about real courage. I always thought it was the dramatic part. The catching, the standing in the doorway, the wall of red that won't move. And it is that. But it's also this. The quiet bit afterwards. The choosing to be kind to someone smaller than you when there's nobody watching and nothing in it for you. He had both. He had the lot. "What's your name?" I asked him. I think I just wanted to know. After a week of mocking him with the others, of treating him like furniture, I wanted to know the name of the man who'd turned out to be the most solid person I'd ever stood near. He gave me a small smile, just the corner of his mouth, and he said, "Doesn't matter." Not rude, almost amused. Like the name really and truly was the least important thing about that morning, which I suppose to him it was. And then he straightened up just slightly, the man folding back into the soldier, and he gave me a small nod and he walked on. And that was it. That was the last I ever saw of him. I never learned his name. I tried a little in the weeks after in a roundabout way, asking the kind of questions you can ask without seeming strange. I never got anywhere. They moved around, the guards posted here and there, and the one from that corridor in that week was just gone, folded back into the long red line of men who stand still while the world walks past and laughs and takes its photos. My contract ended a few weeks later. I moved on. I've had other jobs since, ordinary ones, and I've told this story at dinner tables and in pubs and once, embarrassingly, to a complete stranger on a train who'd made some joke about the guards being a tourist gimmick. I couldn't let it stand. I never can. Because here's what that morning gave me, and it's the thing I most want to leave you with. We spend so much of our lives deciding what people are from the outside. We look at the still ones, the quiet ones, the ones who don't make a fuss or perform for us, and we assume there's nothing much going on in there. We mistake silence for emptiness. We mistake discipline for dullness. We walk past the steadiest people in the world and think they're furniture because they're not loud about what they are. And then one gray Friday the floor drops out from under everything, and it turns out the steady ones, the quiet ones, the ones we mocked, were the only ones holding the building up the whole time. They were never furniture. They were the foundations. We just couldn't see it until the day we needed them. I think about him more than I'd ever admit to most people. Not romantically, before anyone gets the wrong idea. It's not that. It's that he became a kind of measure for me, a way of checking myself. When something hard happens now, when I want to panic, when I want to make it about my own fear, I think of a man going back to his post with adrenaline still roaring through him and choosing to stand still and do the next quiet thing the job required. And I try in my own small, clumsy way to do the same. I usually fail, but I try, and the trying came from him. The brooch is fine, by the way. It went on display that weekend behind its glass in its stateroom, and people queued and looked at the blue of it and walked on, none the wiser. I went to see it on the public opening, stood in the queue like everyone else, paid like everyone else. And when I got to the front and looked at it through the glass, sitting on its little velvet cushion exactly where my own gloved hands had placed it, I felt something I've never quite been able to name. It looked so calm in there, so safe, so permanent, as if nothing could ever touch it, as if it had always been there and always would be, untroubled, eternal. And only a handful of people in the whole world knew the truth. That its being there at all, calm and safe behind that glass, came down to two things on one gray morning. A frightened girl who managed, against everything, to make one ragged sound at exactly the right second. And a quiet man in a red coat who'd been watching the whole time, who everyone walked past like he was nothing, and who turned out to be the strongest thing in the building. We never even knew his name. But the brooch is still there, and so somewhere I hope is he, standing straight, eyes level, holding something up that the rest of us can't even see. And not one of us walking past will ever know.